Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for checking out my channel today. Today, I want to talk about ADHD. I wrote a blog post about it last week, a couple weeks ago. I'm not sure what the delay between YouTube video and blog post is going to be. But I wrote about ADHD recently. It's a thing I work a lot with in my line of work. I've been diagnosed with ADHD personally, so I have personal experience with it. And it's just a topic that I think a lot of people don't have a ton of understanding about. There's a difference between kind of how a clinician, a therapist like myself talks about it, clinically speaking, and then there's a difference between lived experience. And then there's a whole nother world out on like TikTok and Instagram for mental health influencers. So just trying to like cut through some of that stuff. My blog posts, wellnesswithjared.com, are short. Usually I try and keep it to 2.5 pages. I don't want people to have to read a dissertation. I don't want people to have to read an APA style works cited. So they're kind of off the cuff. Like I riff on a topic pretty quick, but it doesn't leave a lot of nuance for what I actually want to talk about. I'm very wordy. I know there's this stereotype that therapists are good listeners, but we like to talk. We spent a lot of years in school, so sometimes we want to talk about what we learned. So yeah, I just want to talk kind of about ADHD. I want to expand on some of the things that I talked about in the blog and go a little bit further into detail. And my mouth can move a lot faster than I can type. That's probably not true. I can probably type faster, but it works better to kind of go stream of conscious when I'm talking than it does with blogging. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Let's start with, I guess, the historical context. It is we're going to talk context because I think context creates meaning. I should do a whole separate video on that, and then we're going to talk semantics a lot because we want to make sure the words we're using make sense. So ADHD as a disorder. ADHD is a disorder related to executive functioning. So frontal lobe of our brain, working memory, things associated with like task completion. There's all this stuff around it. So most people will know ADHD is like you can't sit still, right? Like that's the basic. If we distill every mental health disorder to its bare minimum, what society knows to be true, then ADHD is a kid who can't sit still, right? So, and that's part of the hyperactivity aspect of it, for sure. I got my DSM out just for this video. I can't remember the last time I pulled it off my shelf to kind of go through some of the criteria. But starting with kind of the disorder, a lot of people dislike the diagnosis, or there's some controversy. I don't think it's a controversial diagnosis compared to any other diagnosis, but it has the same issues that most diagnoses have. First, it's a huge spectrum of people that it covers. So in the new DSM, our diagnostic manual, there's 20 criteria, and you need 6 of them. So someone who's better at math could figure out how many different variations of 6 criteria out of 20 potential you could have to still meet a clinically significant diagnosis. Now, the way that I approach diagnosis and the way that I think is correct, a little bit of a soapbox here, the way that I think is correct to approach diagnosis is diagnosis always includes some level of impairment. So there are people out there who are going to have the appropriate amount of criteria to meet a diagnosis, but without any level of impairment, there's no reason to have a diagnosis. In theory, I don't know how someone would get diagnosed when they're thriving. You know, they're not getting sent to the principal's office. They're not getting sent to a therapist. Like if your level of functioning is so high, you're not going to get a diagnosis. And that's part of the issue, right? That's part of my lived experience. I couldn't sit still. I hated school. 3rd grade, vividly remember going to my parents to tell them I didn't want to go to school anymore. I didn't like it. So 8 or 9, I don't know how old I was at that point. My brain already was identifying that like this structure, this system, school, the institution of 8 to 3:30 or 7:30 to 3:30, whatever it was, of sitting still and only having a couple breaks where I could move around and moving at what my brain felt like was a snail's pace for material wasn't doing it for me. But I got good grades. So I was, out of my desk every hour. I was sharpening my pencils multiple times a day. I was doodling. I never took notes. I bouncing leg, tapping my toes, snapping. I had those sweet pens with like the blue cylinder, and then it was white, and it had the 4 different colors so that I could doodle more effectively. I think people use them to like highlight their notes, but I used it so I could have way cooler doodling. But I was that kid who sharpened my pencils every hour. Jeremy, go sit in your desk, do your homework. Well, I'm done with all my homework. Well, then just do it quietly. I put the flag up in the morning. I took the flag down at school. Old school. I'm not this old. I just went to private school, and that sounds like it's rich and fancy, but it was a parochial school, which means it was tied to a religion. So it wasn't rich or fancy. So when I was really little, we still had chalkboard. So right, like I'm not that old. I just think my school didn't have great funding. I was the kid who took the erasers out and like clapped them together to get all the chalk dust off. I had all these extra tasks I did throughout the day because I was done with my homework, and I got good grades, but I was bored constantly. So I was pretty unhappy in school. Private school wasn't helpful for me in that sense. But again, the point of this is not poor pitiful Jeremy. The point of this is to say when your functioning is high, people aren't going to diagnose it. And that's an issue with diagnosis for sure. So there needs to be some level of impairment, and it's a spectrum, right? These are the 2 big points that I kind of covered in all of that rambling. It's a spectrum. So there's a large group of people who will qualify for a diagnosis of ADHD, and putting that label on those people indicates very little similarity, right? Somebody who has ADHD inattentive type versus hyperactive type looks different, but everybody who has ADHD is different. It comes with different things. The diagnosis itself. So let's talk historical context, right? This book, the DSM, is useless. It has its issues. So the original DSM, we're on 5. DSM-1 came about basically as a research tool. We being the scientific community, I'm just including myself there, I'm kind of a big deal. The scientific community needed a way to distinguish between who could qualify for a research study and who couldn't. So if we were going to study depression, what criteria did someone need to meet in order to qualify for that study, so that when papers were studied, when research was done, we kind of had a consensus, generally speaking, of who fit this criteria. So when we said we're studying depression, that meant something. These people fall under that category, these people don't. It wasn't really about health or well-being or even like medical diagnosis. That's why it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was about statistics, like who fits this category and who doesn't, so that when we study these things and publish our findings, people know what we're talking about. And again, people there meant more researchers, scientists than general public. Like this wasn't a thing that was out and about. Even I grew up in the 90s, it wasn't out and about. That's when the diagnosis of ADHD definitely took off, but that doesn't mean it was part of our normal conversations at all yet. So the DSM is really about research, and it has shifted in its usage to the point where the DSM-5, I would say, is predominantly still used for research, and that's probably where it has most of its utility. But it's really used by insurance companies so they can decline to pay for things. As an American speaking, right? So in a very broken health system, you have to use certain diagnoses. Certain diagnoses fit some insurance company's algorithm for how many sessions that person should have, and it's ridiculous, and it absolutely doesn't work. But the DSM, the utility for research is there, but the categories are so broad, and as we've learned more and more about how the brain works, we have to kind of keep updating the DSM, and with each update it gets a little bit better, and then we also wrestle with ongoing issues of does this book help or hurt the profession? And there, I don't know. I joked earlier that it was useless. I don't think that's entirely true. That's not probably. Some days I feel that way. That's not how I land when I think about it critically. But so kind of understanding like what does this diagnosis mean? A diagnosis is simply a category of behaviors. So this person exhibits these behaviors on a regular enough basis. So a lot of diagnoses will include a time frame. Like major depressive disorder has a 6-month time frame attached to it. Cyclothymic disorder, bipolar, usually these things have time frames. So when people say, oh, I'm bipolar, you know, my emotions go like this. Well, I know that that's not an actual diagnosis because there's a time frame for being bipolar. Going through a manic phase usually has a time frame attached to it. It's not one day I'm super happy and the next day I'm super sad. That's not bipolar. It's poor emotional regulation. So, the diagnostic criteria matter, especially to clinicians. The way that a clinician is going to talk about a clinically significant case, which has impairment and meets the clinically significant criteria, is different than how pop culture talks about it. But my issue with ADHD specifically is it's kind of a weird disorder, even in the DSM, in the sense that it's really not written from the perspective of what somebody with ADHD is experiencing. It's written from a perspective of what parents or teachers or type A or bureaucrats or whoever is in charge is looking at this person, because someone with ADHD doesn't inherently fit inside of a box particularly well. That structure, their brain works against the structure. And so it's one of those things where tapping my toes never bothered me. I feel better when I do it. I was just, we had, my wife and I were at an event for my son's school, and it was great. But sitting for over an hour in kind of an understimulating situation, like my knee started bouncing right away, my toe started tapping, like I was fidgety. And like when I'm doing therapy, I'm pretty good because my brain is well stimulated and I'm in an environment that works really well structurally for my brain. I have my record player in my office. I have music going. My brain is well stimulated so it can focus. And my life, the X factors are accounted for. So it's very structured for my brain to focus. And so I can swing an hour in therapy and not get super fidgety and not be distracted. I'm good about it. But put me in an environment where I have to sit and wait, waiting in an airport. I'm on my phone, which isn't inherently great, but is stimulating, or I'm up and walking around, I'm doing things. So in that environment, it doesn't take long for that stuff to come back out. But in an environment like school, where you're supposed to be there for 8 days and you're understimulated and you're not in control of your structure, really terrible. So the symptoms for ADHD are written from a perspective of an authority figure observing, not what somebody is experiencing. I am diagnosed with ADHD. I've never felt impulsive. That's not a feeling. That's what other people see when they look at someone with ADHD. That's not the experience of someone who has ADHD. So the more realistic, I think, diagnostic criteria are the things that I think, as much as I will complain and roll my eyes and call out bad Instagram influencers and social media TikToks around ADHD as kind of the more Hollywood style of ADHD, some of the things that they've done a good job of bringing awareness to are things like ADHD usually is sensory issues. You won't see me with long sleeves down on my wrists. I hate lotion. I don't like things on my skin, but especially on my wrists really bothers me. So all my long sleeves are rolled up. I wear sweatshirts or long sleeves, they're rolled up. I don't have stuff on my wrists. It really irritates me and distracts me quite a bit. Other sensory issues. So again, like being bored is a symptom, not toe tapping. Toe tapping is the symptom that annoys the rest of the class or annoys the teacher, not what I feel better when my leg's bouncing. I'm burning a ton of calories, low key. That's a skinny little kid. And also my brain feels more stimulated because it's my body's moving. I'm doing something. which is better for my brain. So the DSM is just weird in that it's written that way, in a way where like OCD or anxiety is written from an internal experience. What are those people struggling with personally? Some of it, there is that flavor always, is like, what is an observer reporting? And that's helpful to an extent, but ADHD is really heavily written from the perspective of the observer instead of the person who has ADHD, which I think is unhelpful and has led to a lot of lack of knowledge on what somebody who has ADHD is actually experiencing, because the person whose brain is set up that way, like the diagnostic criteria is not written for them, it's written for their parents or teachers who are exasperated with them. One of the criteria, right? I don't know if I can say all of them. Big DSM might get my video taken down. But one of them is what's the inattention section. Often fidgets or taps. We talked about that. Often runs about or climbs in situations where it is inappropriate. Like, that's such a weird thing to write as a diagnostic criteria. All those things are social constructs, and I'm not trying to do a video here on social construction. But when is an appropriate time to run? Like, whenever, right? Like, you shouldn't do it in school, but your body's designed to run. So if you want to walk, or you want to run, or you want to skip, or you want to do cartwheels or somersaults or whatever, like, okay, there's a social norm that's established to say this is inappropriate behavior, give it for this context. But again, the ADHD brain doesn't do structure particularly well, or it does and it can, but it's not particularly interested in the structure. The structure isn't very stimulating. And so it's one of those things where, right, like, it's less about the ADHD brain being broken, it's more about this system we have in place doesn't work very well for this type of person. And that's why I like the neurodiversity movement. That's why I like language like that when we're talking about like typical versus atypical behaviors. When we talk about behaviors fitting on a bell curve, when we talk about things like a spectrum instead of normal, because normal doesn't exist. That's a social construct. Typical, I've used that language for a long time instead of using the word normal, and even typical, I think, has some pejorative nature to it, as far as like a thing is right or wrong, as opposed to I'm trying to use it statistically speaking, right? So this is a typical outcome. This is if we put this person in this experience, this is our expected outcome X amount of times. If we put these people in this experience, this is what our expected outcome is X amount of times. So that's what I try and do with typical. I'm trying to generally use research as opposed to like social constructs or social norms. Social norms shift and change. So what's an appropriate time to run? Well, between 10 o'clock and 10:15 for first recess, and between 12:30 and 1 o'clock for second recess. I had first and second recess growing up, and maybe gym class if you're doing a section that involves movement. But like, that's not how the body's designed to work, ADHD or not. Most bodies require more movement than that, and movement is helpful, especially for children and their development and their motor skills. But even for adults, like getting up and going for a walk after your lunch break is good. Like, we weren't designed, our bodies weren't designed to sit still for 8 hours. Like, that's an unrealistic expectation. Now, are there brains that are wired to do that better than others? Absolutely. But to have a whole section of diagnosis, to have a whole disorder over this is a problem because you can't fit in this structure, and we think everybody should fit in this structure, that's where I would say that the diagnosis is problematic. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a made-up disorder, because it's absolutely not. So this is where, I love the neurodiversity, I love that language, but when I see things like ADHD is an advantage or ADHD is a superpower, that was a big book in the, early aughts, early 2000s maybe. It's kind of a response to the rise of ADHD diagnosis in the 90s, and then this kind of reframing idea came out. It's like ADHD is a superpower. Like, no, it's not. Definitively. I talk about this in my blog. As a superhero nerd, as somebody who loves comics and superhero stories, it is a flaw is to not be able to use your superpower whenever you want. If Superman can only fly some of the time and he doesn't know when that is, not a great superpower. I remember a animated Spider-Man from the 90s. It's on Disney Plus. It isn't as awesome as I remember it being. Where Spider-Man starts, this nightmare fuel from my childhood, Spider-Man starts turning into a spider. But often, his powers are going a little haywire, and that's the premise, the plot for a story he has to overcome and work through is his superpowers are acting up. So if ADHD is a superpower, and the idea there is that the ability to hyperfocus is a superpower, the ability to complete a lot of tasks in a short amount of time is a superpower. It's a terrible superpower. It's the plot of a superpower gone haywire, someone losing a superpower. It isn't the superpower itself. Because someone who has ADHD doesn't know what their brain's going to do, right? Like some days I'm well caffeinated or I'm well stimulated and I get a lot of stuff done. I'm fantastic at getting things done when I'm bumping up against a deadline. And this is where we get into the theory of kind of how ADHD works. So we know it's an issue of executive functioning. We're relatively sure that it's an issue around neurotransmitters, probably dopamine, although some of the research on that is starting to get looked at in different ways. And again, like science is an ongoing process, so we're learning more and more. The brain is one of the most complex things we study, and it's difficult to kind of know every aspect of it because it's constantly in flux. So we can't isolate certain criteria just to study the brain really effectively, and we can't just cut into it unless the brain is no longer attached to a living person, and then it doesn't tell us nearly as much information. So it's a very complex thing to study, and it's hard to study it. So as technology improves, we find more and more information. One of the things with the dopamine idea behind ADHD is stimulants help. So stimulating the activity of dopamine, producing more dopamine, having more dopamine landing in the appropriate receptors means we get more stuff done. So ADHD is about dopamine so it's kind of like this deductive reasoning thing. It does seem to fit pretty well, and the newer research that's kind of calling it in question is basically saying, well, that's based off of people who are on stimulants. So our control group for those studies isn't super great. But dopamine is tied to reward at getting tasks done. Dopamine is tied to motivation. So there are a lot of things that the person who has ADHD is going to experience that fits for why it would be related to dopamine. But again, just good to note, I think, that like as a profession, we're constantly updating those things based on what the research is telling us, based on what we're learning through new science and studying things continually. So executive functioning, that executive functioning covers a lot. So again, frontal lobe activity, forgetfulness, getting things done, motivation, emotional regulation. So again, that's another big symptom a lot of people experience, where it's simply in the DSM labeled impulsivity, but where people who have ADHD are experiencing it is in their relationships, in their friendships, in their romantic relationships, where they're struggling to regulate their own emotions well enough where they can deal with somebody else's emotions. So they seem impulsive, or they seem sporadic, or they seem not trustworthy, or whatever it kind of might be in a particular context. It's that executive brain functioning that's not firing the way that it's supposed to. It's either overfiring or underfiring. And so it's one of those things where it's learning how to navigate some of these things. I think the diagnosis of ADHD for somebody who has it is very helpful from a professional who knows what ADHD actually is like, instead of just going off of diagnostic criteria. So who's someone who can work with you on the emotional regulation, who can work with you on the motivational structures you have in your life, the pattern of reward that you have in your life, how to manage stimuli in a helpful way. I talk a lot about, like, for me personally, my experience with ADHD, having music on is tied heavily to getting things done, whether it's doing the dishes, folding laundry, working out, making food, meal prep's a whole separate issue. but it's all this stuff. I'm better with music on. I'm significantly more productive by having music on. I have music on almost all the time in my life, whether it's just as background noise. I really enjoy listening to music, so sometimes I'm very focused on it. But it's a big part of like getting stuff done for me. Whereas visual stimuli, like having a video on YouTube or having a show on in the background, is way more distracting for me. That's my experience. I don't think that's true for everyone, but I think that's true for a lot of people, where there's a threshold that stimuli goes from being helpful to being distracting. And so it's just learning how to be intentional about that stuff. It's learning how to kind of identify that stuff, gain awareness around that stuff, and then how do we kind of manage and structure it. So I will often say the ADHD brain doesn't like structure, but it does well with structure. It just doesn't structure itself. So we need to figure out structures that work. I was constantly in trouble as a kid for never putting any of my clothes away. All my clothes were piled on top of my dresser. My mom would get very frustrated every once in a while and would just dump them all on the floor in a big pile. The clothes that were in my dresser I very rarely wore, and the clothes that were on top of my dresser I wore pretty regularly, and it was a mess, right? My room was a mess. I'm not dismissing that. I don't know that putting it all in a big pile was particularly helpful. But again, like, I didn't get my diagnosis till significantly later in life, even though I think with hindsight, somebody should have picked up on it way earlier. Not with hindsight, looking at it objectively, somebody should have picked up on it way earlier. But instead of saying, well, put your clothes away, put your clothes away, put your clothes away, put your clothes away, make your brain fit this structure, finding a structure that worked well for me. And my wife, who's super supportive and loving and wonderful in a lot of ways, has to deal with some of that stuff in our personal life. We don't have doors on our closets in our house. I like to see everything. My brain does better when I can see everything. Otherwise, it struggles to come up with like what to wear. And that seems like such a weird thing, but like if I don't see it, I genuinely forget about it. All my clothes are outside a dresser. I have open-faced bins. Just bumped my microphone because I'm talking with my hands. I have open-faced bins that all my clothes are in that don't need to be hung up. What does need to be hung up is hung up in a closet that doesn't have a door on it, so I can see it. So that visual component, I'll laugh with even that small experience, like how you store your clothing. A lot of people with ADHD relate to is like they have their laundry chair, or they have this thing where like the clothes that they cycle through regularly are out somewhere where they can see them, and their other stuff they don't use very often. So again, it's working with the brain to find a structure that works, not trying to restrict the brain to one particular structure, but we still do land at a place where structure is helpful and beneficial and necessary. So it's interesting for sure in kind of like how that works. One of the things that I think comes along with having a neurotypical or neurodiverse brain is like thinking outside the box. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're gonna have a lot of that like thinking outside the box, which is just kind of a weird cliche. But in this instance, it's helpful in that someone who has ADHD, I'm a therapist who has ADHD, so when I'm working with people who have ADHD, it's easy for me, not always, but often, to come up with a solution for a structure that doesn't fit other people's structures, because my brain has never been particularly interested in that. So the way that I always talk about it is like monkey bars. We want to have monkey bars. They're solid. We don't want monkey bars that are wobbly. We don't want our structure to be inconsistent. We want our structure to be solid, but how we use our structure is very unique. So on monkey bars, you can do pull-ups for strength training. You can race across them with your friends. You can sit on top of them and gossip. How you use the monkey bars varies, but the structure itself doesn't change. So I think that's a helpful approach. But even with that reality of like, I think I have my ADHD pretty well managed through diet and exercise and trying to be really good with my sleep. My life as an adult is structured around shorter chunks of time. So there's not a ton in my life that takes up more than an hour. Really, my job is something different every hour. I have time where I can, not always, but often, I structure time in my day where I can get up and go outside, go for walks. Getting breaks and moving around is super helpful. I have a job where I have music on all the time. I have a job that's very stimulating mentally. So that certainly helps. So as an adult, and a lot of adults who have ADHD structure their lives where they're not accountants, they're not having that 9-to-5 type job. They're entrepreneurs, or they're business owners, or they have jobs that they're on the go. They're reporters or videographers or whatever. So they're doing a lot of different stuff. Their job looks different on a regular basis. So that brain having some structure where they can get things done, but not so rigid that they become disenfranchised with it, I think is really helpful. What I'm bad about with doing these videos is ever thinking about how I'm going to end them. I'm just trying to run through my head and think about what else I wanted to cover. Probably a bunch of other stuff. This is kind of stream of consciousness for me, but I wanted to kind of extrapolate on some of those ideas that I talked about in the blog. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail, which I think I was able to do. Definitely, this is a topic that I think like needs continual mental health in general, right? But like diagnoses, the utility of them, pros and cons of the DSM, like these are all things that are ongoing conversations. These are not things that because I did a video today means that like this is the definitive stance on it. Always being open to learning more as more research comes out, as our technology advances and we can study the brain in different ways, seeing how that goes. But definitely it's one of those things where like I think having a diagnosis of ADHD when you're ADHD is super helpful because you can learn different skills and how to structure and do things differently. Medication obviously can be helpful. Stimulants help anyone. That's why college students take Adderall, whether they have ADHD or not, to study for their exams. It helps you focus. But I think like approaching it from a perspective of not needing a medication, if you don't want to be on medication, it's definitely possible. Learning the skills and the tools that you need from therapy, having a professional work with you to come up with a plan that fits for you specifically, tailor fit to your uniqueness and the qualities that make your brain different than everyone else's. So I think that can be really helpful. It's a topic that I'm passionate about because I was a kid who didn't get that diagnosis. I think would have benefited from it, although I probably wouldn't have been on medication. I wasn't on medication ever. I'm not now. I definitely self-medicate with caffeine, which is a stimulant. But it's one of those things where like learning how to kind of manage some of that stuff and having a professional help walk you through that stuff so that you can kind of learn and explore. When I was finally diagnosed, when I was in therapy, so like learning, having somebody to kind of help me even process some of my own thoughts on it and get a little bit more organized on some of those things with a structure that worked particularly well for me personally. And then learning how to like explain it to your loved ones, to the people in your support group, your romantic relationships. I mentioned my wife earlier being really supportive of it and awesome, but that's been a work in progress as I've learned about myself and how my brain works, what works for it and what doesn't, how to then communicate that, how to build a structure that's reasonable for somebody who's neurodiverse in different ways, or neurotypical versus neurodiverse. I tend to think we're all neurodiverse in our ways, not to dilute the utility of that phrase. But again, like kind of that normal doesn't exist. Superpowers don't exist, and ADHD definitely is one. Look at that really good wrap up. I'm so pleased with myself, and I'm going to talk right through it. So again, thanks for stopping by. Drop down, leave me a comment. I'll check those out and try and respond to them and be involved here as I can with the channel as it gets going here. Head over to wellnesswithjer.com. Follow me on Instagram at wellnesswithjer. Wellnesswithjer.com's got the blog posts. I blog weekly on a bunch of different topics. So check that out. Contact me if you want me to answer a specific question. If you want to work with me, I'm licensed in the state of Wisconsin, so doing therapy there. Yeah, thanks for stopping by. Peace.